Silver scraped across porcelain before anybody said a word. Not the soft kind either. The sharp kind people make when they're trying to look rich while eating chicken that still came from Costco. I sat at the far end of my parents' dining table in my Army Class A uniform, shoulders tight from 14 straight hours on Interstate 44 and 2 gas station coffees that tasted like burnt pennies. My duffel bag was still sitting in the trunk because nobody had asked if I needed help bringing it inside. Marcus was standing near the wine cabinet like he owned a vineyard in Napa instead of a leased BMW and 3 maxed-out credit cards. And the buyer walked in, he said, holding the bottle up dramatically, looked at the infinity pool and literally said, "Marcus, this is the nicest property I've ever seen in St. Louis County." He poured Cabernet into Eleanor's glass first. Always Eleanor first. My mother tilted the glass toward the chandelier like she was judging a competition on Food Network. Oh, that's smooth. It should be, Marcus said. $1.80 a bottle. Richard laughed too hard at that. That's my boy, expensive taste. I looked up at the chandelier myself. Brand new, matte black iron frame, probably 12 bulbs. The old brass one from my childhood was gone. So was the wallpaper. So was the grandfather clock. But the crack above the hallway archway was still there. They'd painted over it. That pretty much summed up my family. Still drinking tap water? Marcus asked me. I glanced at the sweating glass near my plate. Yep, he smirked. You know Dad installed that filtration system because the city water tested weird last year. Then I guess I'll either survive or become Spider-Man. Eleanor gave a polite laugh you give strangers at church. Marcus barely looked at me before turning back to his audience. That was the thing about my brother. He never really talked to people, he performed at them. The market's insane right now, he continued. You just have to know how to move assets before rates shift again. Assets. That was Marcus language. Girlfriends were assets, houses were assets. Most days, I think he'd refer to oxygen as a shared resource if he thought it sounded expensive enough. I cut into the dry chicken breast on my plate while Marcus walked everyone through another story about a waterfront sitting outside Lake St. Louis. Richard nodded along like he was listening to Warren Buffett explain the stock market. Meanwhile, nobody had asked me a single question since I arrived. Not about Fort Leonard Wood, not about my deployment schedule, not about the flood recovery project my engineering unit had been running for 6 months. Nothing. Eleanor finally looked my direction after almost 20 minutes. You still doing roads? I swallowed a bite of chicken. Infrastructure and terrain assessment. Oh, she nodded quickly. That sounds technical. Marcus jumped back in before silence could breathe. You should seen this couple from Dallas. Total nightmare. They wanted the marble imported from Italy verified. I almost laughed into my water. Because the funny part was, Marcus had never built anything in his life. I'd spent the last 3 years studying soil compression reports, floodplain stability, and foundation failures while sleeping in temporary field housing half the time. Marcus sold oversized kitchens to people who said words like curated and bespoke with straight faces. But somehow, he was the successful child. Richard carved into his steak and pointed his fork toward Marcus. That's real business right there. Relationship management. I looked around the dining room again. Fresh paint, new crown molding, designer candles lined up near the fireplace. Everything smelled faintly like cedar and expensive detergent. But I also noticed the unopened final notice envelope shoved halfway under a stack of mail near the kitchen counter. Marcus talked louder whenever bills got worse. That was another family tradition. You know what the problem is with military jobs? Marcus said suddenly. I looked up. Here we go. They teach you structure, he said, sipping wine. But the real world runs on leverage. I'm serious. Civilian life is about influence, negotiation, timing. I nodded slowly, and apparently saying the word luxury every 14 seconds. Richard laughed immediately. Not because it was funny, because Marcus allowed it to be funny. My father wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. Your brother understands people. That's why he isn't. There it was. Wins. Everything in our house had always been a competition I never realized I entered. Marcus got praised for talking. I got tolerated for functioning. Eleanor reached over and adjusted the sleeve of my uniform like she was fixing a display in a department store. You really drove all night in this? I left base at 4:12 yesterday afternoon. Oh, honey, she frowned. You should flown. I almost asked if she planned to reimburse the ticket. Instead, I took another sip of water. Across the table, Marcus was already opening a second bottle. The label flashed under the chandelier light while he told another story about a rooftop cocktail event in Clayton where everybody important supposedly knew him. I remembered Grandma Margaret once calling Marcus a man who confuses attention with respect. At the time, Marcus laughed it off. Now I understood exactly what she meant. The room got louder as dinner dragged on. Forks clinked, wine poured. Eleanor kept smiling too hard. Richard kept interrupting people to mention how competitive the housing market was, even though he retired from selling industrial HVAC units 9 years ago. And through all of it, I sat there in a pressed army uniform that suddenly felt invisible. Nobody asked why I looked tired. Nobody noticed my hands still had faint cuts from surveying rocky terrain near a damaged riverbank 3 days earlier. Nobody cared that I'd driven 14 hours just to be there. I watched my family admire Marcus the way people admire fireworks. Bright, loud, gone 5 seconds later. Then Marcus raised his glass. "To family," he announced. Everyone lifted their wine except me. I kept my hand wrapped around plain tap water while their crystal glasses touched under the chandelier. The sound echoed through the dining room, sharp, hollow, practiced. And sitting there at the far end of that polished mahogany table, surrounded by people sharing my last name, I realized something that should hurt more than it did. I wasn't home. I was a ghost haunting my own family's dinner. Have you ever sat in a room full of people who claim to love you, but somehow still felt like the least important person at the table? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about family, dignity, and the quiet moment people finally stop letting themselves be used, subscribe to the channel. The sound of crystal tapping crystal barely faded before my mother lifted a butter knife and tapped it twice against her wine glass. Not hard, just enough to make everybody stop pretending this was still dinner. "Well," Eleanor said with a bright smile, "before dessert, we wanted to discuss something important as a family." There it was, the real reason I'd been invited. Marcus slid his chair back immediately like they'd rehearsed the timing. He disappeared into the hallway for a second, then came back carrying a black presentation tube under one arm. I almost respected the commitment to theatrics. He laid the tube across the table beside the half-eaten cheesecake and pulled out a rolled stack of glossy blueprints. Richard actually grinned. My father grinned at architectural paper the way normal people grin at newborn babies. Marcus spread the pages across the tablecloth, right over Eleanor's decorative candles, floor plans, elevations, parking layouts, commercial renderings. A large green sign near the corner of the drawing read, "Cedar Ridge Commons Luxury Retail and Lifestyle Plaza." I stared at it for a few seconds, then I saw the address, Grandma Margaret's farmhouse. Marcus smoothed the paper dramatically with both hands. "This," he announced, "is our opportunity. Our," interesting word choice from a man currently behind on 2 car payments. Eleanor folded her hands together. "Honey, we've been talking about this for months." Of course they had, without me. Richard leaned forward in his chair. The property value exploded after the new highway extension got approved. Marcus nodded eagerly. "Sterling Capital wants the land before the county rezones the area next spring. Timing's perfect." I looked down at the blueprint again. The old porch was gone in the rendering. So was Grandma's vegetable garden. The oak tree beside the well had been replaced by something labeled outdoor seating area. Nothing says family legacy like artisan sandwiches and boutique yoga studios. Marcus pointed toward the center drawing, mixed-use retail, upscale tenants, coffee shop, wine bar, fitness studio. Sterling already has anchor interest from 2 chains. "Congratulations," I said. "You found a way to turn Grandma's house into an airport shopping terminal." Richard sighed heavily, already irritated by my tone. "Don't start. I'm just trying to understand why I'm seeing this for the first time." Eleanor jumped in quickly. "Because we wanted everyone together." "No, they wanted an audience." Marcus tapped the blueprint with one finger. "Look, the farmhouse is falling apart anyway." That almost made me laugh. I'd repaired the west porch railing myself 3 summers ago after Grandma's arthritis got too bad for her to manage stairs safely. I'd coordinated foundation drainage work after heavy flooding near the creek. I knew every inch of that property. Marcus hadn't visited the farmhouses in almost 8 years, unless somebody else was cooking food there. "The structure's outdated," he continued. "And honestly, the land is worth more than the house." That sentence hung in the room for a second. Worth more than the house. I remembered Grandma Margaret saying almost the exact opposite once while we sat on the porch during a thunderstorm. People who only understand price never understand value. Richard cleared his throat. Sterling Capital's offering serious money. How serious? Marcus smiled immediately. Initial letter of intent came in at 2.8 million. Eleanor placed a hand against her chest like she might faint directly into the cheesecake. Can you imagine? She whispered. Yeah, I could. I could also. Marcus already spending it. Probably on another Italian suit he couldn't afford. Probably on another networking event full of men named Brent. Richard pointed toward the blueprint again. This could change the family's future. I looked around the room slowly. Fresh paint, new chandelier, expensive wine, and underneath all of it, panic. That was the funny thing about people drowning financially. They become obsessed with looking dry. When exactly were you planning to tell me? I asked. Marcus gave me a tight smile. Right now. That's not telling me, that's unveiling a hostage video. Eleanor exhaled sharply. Alina, please don't make this difficult. I stared at her. Difficult. I drove 14 hours to eat overcooked chicken and accidentally attend a corporate land seizure. But sure, I was the difficult one. Marcus leaned back confidently. Look, we already spoke with the developer, the broker, and the county contact. Everybody agrees this is the smartest move. Everybody? You know what I mean. No, I said calmly. I actually don't. For the first time all evening, the room lost rhythm. Richard reached for his wine glass. Your brother's trying to build something here. He's trying to sell Grandma's house. Marcus laughed lightly. See, that's exactly why you don't understand this stuff. I looked at him. He kept going. You think emotionally because you lived there for a little while taking care of her. A little while. I moved into the farmhouse for 9 months after Grandma's second hip surgery because nobody else volunteered. Marcus sent flowers once. Wrong address, too. She raised all of us, I said. Exactly, Marcus replied. Which is why this should benefit all of us. There it was again, that word. Us. The favorite word of people asking for something that already belongs to somebody else. Eleanor straightened in her chair and forced another smile. Okay, let's just do the family vote and move forward. I almost thought she was joking. Then Richard raised his hand immediately. Marcus raised his right after him. Eleanor followed half a second later, 3 hands. Fast, smooth, prearranged. Like they'd practiced this exact motion in the kitchen before I arrived. I looked at them sitting there beneath the chandelier with their wine glasses and rehearsed confidence. Then Marcus smiled at me like a teacher, waiting for a slow student to catch up. Well, he asked, you already voted. Richard frowned. I'm not being childish. I'm being observant. Marcus crossed his arms. 3-1 majority. I actually laughed that time, not loud, just enough, because suddenly the whole thing became ridiculous. My family thought property law worked like a high school student council election. You can't vote to sell somebody's property, I said. Marcus shook his head impatiently. Jesus, Elena, this isn't a military briefing. No, I replied. Military briefings usually involve facts. Richard's face tightened immediately. Marcus leaned forward. Look, soldiers don't really understand real estate transactions. Interesting, because Army engineers understand land better than most developers ever will. I looked down at the blueprint one more time. Boutique retail, luxury parking, outdoor dining. They'd already erased Grandma from the property before the deal even closed. Then I looked back at the 3 raised hands still hovering around the table like they actually meant something, and that's when I realized the truth. They hadn't invited me to dinner. They had invited me to surrender. The problem was, a family vote cannot rewrite a county deed. The image of their raised hands stayed in my head for exactly 3 seconds before another sound pushed it away. Rain. Hard rain. The kind that pounds against a tin roof so steadily it turns into background noise after a while. 4 years earlier, I sat beside Grandma Margaret on the farmhouse porch while a summer storm rolled across Warren County. Water spilled off the roof gutters in heavy sheets, splashing into muddy gravel below us. The air smelled like wet dirt, cedar wood, and the faint gasoline scent from Grandpa's old rusted tractor sitting near the barn. Grandma always said storms made the property honest. Rain tells you where the ground's weak, she used to say. I believed her. I was 27 then, home on leave between assignments, sleeping in the upstairs bedroom because Grandma had stopped trusting the stairs after her second hip surgery. The farmhouse creaked constantly at night. Pipes knocked in the walls. Wind pushed through the old window frames. I loved every inch of it. That afternoon, we sat on the porch sorting heirloom seed packets into small metal tins while thunder rolled somewhere beyond the tree line. Grandma wore a faded cardinal sweatshirt and thick reading glasses sliding down her nose. Her hands shook sometimes, but her eyes missed nothing, especially people. "You put the Cherokee purple tomatoes with the wrong pile again," she said without looking up. "I did that once. You did it twice. First time was June." I laughed quietly. "Good to know the FBI could never hide evidence from you," she snorted, not laughed. Grandma Margaret never wasted a full laugh unless somebody earned it. Rain hammered the tin roof harder while she organized packets with military precision. Beans, squash, corn, tomatoes. "Your brother would rather die than do this," I said. "Your brother thinks parsley comes from Whole Foods." That one got a real laugh out of me. She smiled slightly without lifting her head. "Marcus only likes things after somebody rich touches them." That was Grandma's version of brutal honesty. Simple, accurate, no wasted words. A cold gust of wind pushed rain mist across the porch. I pulled the old wool blanket tighter around her knees. "You cold?" "I'm 82 years old," she replied. "I've been cold since 1997. I handed her coffee from the thermos sitting beside me. She took one sip and grimaced. "You still make coffee like army fuel. You still drink it. Because I survived Nixon. I can survive this." Thunder cracked closer this time. Somewhere down the property, the old windmills squealed against the storm. I leaned back in the porch chair and watched rainwater collect near the gravel driveway. My engineering brain automatically started tracking drainage flow out of habit. Grandma noticed immediately. "You're studying the slope again. The runoff's getting worse near the east side. You always watch the ground. That's literally my job." "No," she said quietly. "It's who you are." That shut me up for a second. Most people in my family only notice things about you if they could turn it into bragging rights at dinner parties. Marcus got compliments because he talked loud. I got silence because competence doesn't photograph well. Grandma was different. She noticed things people tried to hide from themselves. After a while, she set the seed tin aside and looked out toward the pasture. "You know what your father sees when he looks at this property?" I already knew. "Money." "Mm-hmm. And Marcus sees commissions," I added. "They'll tear this place apart one day." I looked over at her. She wasn't emotional when she said it, just certain. "Shiny things," she continued. "Always have." Rainwater dripped steadily from the porch roof while she reached down beside her rocking chair and lifted a thick manila folder from the floor. Old folder, bent corners, county seal stamped on the front. She handed it to me carefully. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside sat several notarized documents clipped together, with a blue county filing receipt. I saw my name immediately, Elena Mary Vance. Then I saw the property description, 4.2 acres, legal transfer, recorded deed. I looked up too fast. "Grandma, I finalized it last month. You gave me the land, I protected the land." My brain immediately shifted into practical mode. "What about the house?" "The house stays in trust temporarily after I'm gone." She took another sip of terrible coffee. "Your father will think he inherited something valuable." I stared at her. "You planned this." I raised Richard. "Of course I planned this." Rain crashed against the roof hard enough to drown out the wind for a few seconds. I looked back down at the paperwork. The transfer was airtight. Survey maps, parcel division, county recording numbers, everything legally executed. "You never told anyone?" "Because your family confuses ownership with entitlement." That sounded exactly like her. I flipped another page slowly. "Why me?" She gave me a look like I'd asked why gravity existed. "Because you understand foundations." I leaned back quietly. The storm kept rolling over us while water rushed through the drainage ditch near the driveway. Grandma pointed toward the farmhouse. "A house without land underneath it is just lumber waiting to collapse." I looked at the old structure sitting beyond the rain, white paint peeling near the shutters, porch sagging slightly on the west side, kitchen light glowing warm through the storm. Home. "They'll chase the house," she continued softly, "because that's what people see." Then she tapped the paperwork resting in my lap. "But the ground matters more." For a while, neither of us spoke. The rain handled conversation fine by itself. I remember looking down at the deed again, while thunder rolled low across the fields. My name sat there in black inks beside county certification stamps and legal descriptions most people would skip over. But I understood every line. So did Grandma. Marcus would see a farmhouse someday. Developers would see commercial acreage. My father would see dollar signs. But sitting there beside Grandma Margaret with rain pounding the roof and the smell of wet cedar filling the porch air, I finally understood what she was really giving me. Not property, responsibility. They wanted the bricks. But she gave me the roots. The sound of rain on the farmhouse roof faded into the hard, metallic buzzing of my phone rattling across my government-issued desk. Bzzzt, bzzzt. I glanced at the clock mounted above the engineering office doorway. 11:14 a.m. Tuesday, Fort Leonard Wood. Outside my office window, a convoy truck rolled slowly across the motor pool lot. While two specialists argued beside a drainage marker, somebody had apparently hit again. Inside, I had 3 topographic maps spread across my desk and a half-finished report on floodplain reinforcement near Pulaski County. Then my phone buzzed again. I picked it up. 14 missed calls. 8 from Eleanor, 5 from Marcus, 1 from an unknown number with a St. Louis area code. I stared at the screen for a second. Then another call came through. Immediately, Marcus. Declined. The phone buzzed again before I even set it down. That was fast. Usually Marcus needed at least 1 full business day before consequences became real to him. I leaned back in my chair and opened the newest voicemail transcription. Alina, pick up the damn phone. That was Marcus. No greeting, no performance voice. Interesting. The next voicemail came from Eleanor. Honey, there's some confusion with paperwork and we just need to clear something up. Delete. Another buzz. Another text. Call me now. 30 seconds later, Marcus, did you know about this? I looked down at the survey maps on my desk instead. Steady contour lines, drainage calculations, reliable things, unlike my family. The office door opened slightly and Sergeant Wilkes poked his head inside holding a clipboard. Captain Vance, you still want the revised soil density report before lunch? Yeah, leave it there. He noticed my phone vibrating again on the metal desk. Everything okay? Family discovered legal documents exist. He blinked once. Ah, so not okay. Correct. He nodded respectfully and backed out of the office without another question. That's one thing I appreciated about Army engineers. Nobody dramatizes panic when infrastructure's involved. We just identify structural failure and move accordingly. My phone lit up again. Number, I answered this one. A nervous male voice spoke immediately. Captain Vance, yes. Hi, my name's Miss Crowley with Hensley Title Group in Clayton. I'm handling escrow review for Sterling Capital's acquisition on County Route DD. There it was, title agent. The poor bastard who just stepped on a landmine wearing loafers. How can I help you, Mr. Crowley? A pause, paper shuffling. We ran the preliminary title search this morning and encountered a recorded severance deed tied to parcel 4B. Okay, another pause. You're listed as sole legal owner of the acreage underneath and surrounding the farmhouse. Correct. He lowered his voice. Instinctively, like Marcus might jump out of a cabinet nearby. The seller disclosure we received did not mention this. I almost laughed. Of course it didn't. Marcus treated paperwork the same way toddlers treat vegetables. Mr. Crowley continued carefully. Without unified land rights, Sterling Capital cannot obtain clear development access. Correct. And, according to county filings, the main driveway easement also crosses your parcel. Also correct. Long silence. I could practically hear this man reconsidering his entire career path. Finally, he cleared his throat. Miss Vance, were you aware your family intended to sell the property? I became aware during dessert. Another silence. Then, very professionally, he said, Understood. We ended the call 30 seconds later. No yelling. No drama. Just facts. That's the funny thing about legal ownership. Once paperwork enters the room, emotional manipulation suddenly develops a limp. My phone exploded again, almost immediately. Eleanor, please answer. Eleanor, your brother is very upset. 2 seconds later, Eleanor, I don't understand why you hid this from us. I stared at that message longer than I expected. Why you hid this from us. Interesting accusation coming from people who staged a fake family vote over property they didn't legally control. Another message appeared. Marcus. This is unbelievable. Marcus, Sterling is threatening to pull the deal. Marcus, do you have any idea how bad this makes me look? That one actually made me smile, not because I enjoyed his panic. Because even now, Marcus's biggest concern wasn't Grandma's property. It was embarrassment. I set the phone face down and returned to my contour analysis. 30 seconds later, more buzzing. Elinor, your father is furious. Elinor, call us right now. Then, Elinor, this is selfish Elena. And finally, the message that told me the panic had officially crossed into chaos. Elinor, the deed says separated parcel. What does that even mean? Misspelled. No punctuation. Typing speeds increasing. Yeah, they were spiraling now. Outside the office, somebody dropped a metal toolbox hard enough to echo down the hallway. A forklift beeped in reverse somewhere beyond the loading bay. Normal Tuesday sounds. Meanwhile, 300 miles away, my family's fantasy was collapsing inside a title office conference room. I imagined Marcus standing there in one of his expensive suits, smiling too aggressively while somebody from Sterling Capital slowly explained the difference between owning a house and owning the land under it. That must have been a rough morning. Another call. Richard, I let it ring. Then voicemail. Alina, this is ridiculous. Call your mother. Not hello. Not how are you. Not we should talk. Straight to command voice, like as was 16 again. I deleted the voicemail and opened the county GIS map saved on my desktop computer instead. Parcel lines appeared across the screen in clean digital overlays. 4.2 acres. Recorded and protected 4 years earlier. Grandma had done everything properly. No loopholes, no confusion, no ambiguity. That was another thing people misunderstood about her. They thought because she baked pies and watched Cardinals games, she wasn't dangerous. Meanwhile, she'd quietly split a property deed like a woman planning a bank robbery. My phone buzzed again. Marcus, you sabotaged this on purpose. I stared at the message. Then finally typed my first response of the entire day. No sabotage. Just ownership. I hit send. 3 dots appeared instantly, then disappeared, then appeared again. Marcus was probably typing with both thumbs and a forehead vein bulging out of his expensive haircut. I locked the screen before his reply came through. Because honestly, there wasn't anything else to discuss. The deal wasn't collapsing because of me. It was collapsing. Marcus built $1 million transaction on assumptions instead of facts. And assumptions are expensive when county records get involved. I picked up my ruler and aligned it carefully against the topographic map again, while my phone continued vibrating nearly off the desk. My breathing stayed level. My hands stayed steady. My pulse never moved. Army training teaches you something useful about emergencies. The loudest person in the room usually lost control first. Panic is just arrogance losing its balance. The vibration of my phone finally stopped around Thursday afternoon. The car doors outside my apartment started Friday at 6:42 p.m. 2 heavy slams. Not visitors. An arrival. I was standing at my kitchen counter making boxed macaroni because I'd spent the entire week reviewing flood mitigation reports and honestly didn't have the emotional energy for vegetables. My apartment sat about 15 minutes outside base housing limits in a quiet complex filled with junior officers, divorced nurses, and one retired guy who repaired lawnmowers on his balcony like it was a sacred duty. Then headlights swept across my living room window. I looked outside. Richard's black Tahoe, of course. Nothing says, we need to respect boundaries, like driving 4 hours unannounced. A second later came the knock. Not normal knocking either. My father knocked like he was serving a warrant. 3 hard bangs against the door. I opened it halfway. Eleanor stood there holding a leather tote bag against her chest. Richard stood beside her, with his jaw already clenched like he'd been practicing arguments during the entire drive from St. Louis. Neither of them said hello. Richard walked in first without waiting, also very on brand. You couldn't answer your phone, he snapped. I could, I said calmly. I chose peace instead. Eleanor immediately shifted into performance mode. Oh, honey, she reached for my arm. This whole thing has gotten so blown out of proportion. There was the voice, soft, fragile, carefully calibrated. My mother could cry on command faster than most people unlock their phones. I stepped back and closed the apartment door quietly behind them. Richard looked around the apartment immediately. Small living room, government furniture, folded uniforms near the laundry basket, engineering manuals stacked beside the couch. His expression said the same thing it always did when he visited military housing years ago for my commissioning ceremony. You live like this on purpose? Meanwhile, Marcus probably spent more monthly on hair products than my electric bill. Eleanor set her tote bag on the kitchen counter and pulled out several folded papers, along with a cheap blue pen from a hotel conference room. That caught my attention. Ah, paperwork. We just need to handle this quickly, she said brightly. Richard dropped heavily into a kitchen chair. Your brother's losing investors by the hour. I looked at the papers, quitclaim deed, freshly printed, crooked staple in the corner, no attorney letterhead. Marcus definitely prepared this himself, which was comforting in the same way finding your surgeon watching YouTube tutorials would be comforting. Eleanor slid the papers toward me. If you sign this, everything goes back to normal. Back to normal. Interesting phrase. Because normal in my family usually meant Marcus getting what he wanted while everyone else adjusted around him like furniture. I didn't touch the papers. Instead, I leaned against the counter and crossed my arms. You drove 4 hours for this, for family, Eleanor corrected softly. No, they drove 4 hours for land access. Family was just the coupon code they used at checkout. Richard pointed toward the deed. Sterling Capital's threatening litigation now. They're threatening to walk away. Same thing. No, I replied. Very different thing legally. That irritated him immediately. My father hated precise language during arguments because facts slowed down intimidation. Eleanor sat beside him, and suddenly her eyes became glossy. Right on schedule. Her voice cracked slightly. Do you have any idea what your brother's been going through? I stayed quiet. He worked so hard building that business. Marcus's brokerage had changed names 3 times in 6 years. At one point, he called himself a luxury acquisition strategist, which I'm pretty sure just meant he owned too many blazers. Eleanor dabbed the corner of her eye carefully. He could lose everything, I almost answered, then stopped myself. Because something finally clicked in my head while I stood there looking at them in my tiny apartment. Nobody had driven 4 hours when I graduated officer candidate school. Nobody visited after my deployment extension got approved. Nobody showed up during the winter I spent sleeping 3 hours a night managing emergency flood response operations. But suddenly the family GPS worked perfectly when Marcus's commission checks got threatened. Richard leaned forward aggressively. Your mother and I sacrificed a lot raising you. There it was. Debt collection disguised as parenting. I looked at him evenly. You mean basic legal responsibilities? His face darkened immediately. Don't get smart with me. Too late. The army already invested in it. That almost made Eleanor lose control of the script for half a second. Then the tears returned. You know what hurts the most, she whispered. Your grandmother would hate seeing this family divided. That one landed harder, because she knew exactly where to aim. Grandma Margaret mattered. Still, I answered honestly. No, I said quietly. Grandma would hate watching you turn her house into a parking lot. Silence, heavy silence. Richard stood up so fast the chair legs scraped against the tile floor. Enough. His voice filled the apartment instantly, loud, sharp, commanding. The same voice he used my entire childhood whenever disagreement offended him personally. Family requires sacrifice. I looked at him for a long moment. Then down at the quitclaim deed waiting on my kitchen counter, beside boxed macaroni and a half-empty bottle of hot sauce. Family requires sacrifice. Funny how sacrifice in my family always traveled one direction. Marcus needed money, I sacrificed. Marcus made mistakes, I adjusted. Marcus failed. Everybody else paid emotional taxes. Eleanor pushed the pen closer toward me. Just sign it and this all disappears. No, that wasn't true. If I signed it, this wouldn't disappear. It would become permanent. Because once people learn they can guilt you into surrendering boundaries, they stop seeing you as family. They start seeing you as access. I looked at my parents standing inside an apartment they'd never visited before tonight. Not once. Not during promotions. Not during holidays I spent alone on base. Not during anything. And suddenly I understood something ugly but incredibly clear. Their love had always come with terms and conditions. Compliance, convenience, usefulness. That was the real contract. I picked up the quitclaim deed. Richard relaxed immediately. Then I folded the papers once, twice, and handed them back to Eleanor. I'm not signing this. Richard's face turned red almost instantly. You're being selfish. No, I replied calmly. I'm being the owner. Eleanor started crying harder now. Real frustration finally slipping through the performance. You're destroying this family. I walked to the front door and opened it. Cool evening air drifted into the apartment hallway. For a second, nobody moved. Then Richard grabbed the papers off the counter violently while Eleanor collected her purse with shaking hands. Before leaving, my father stopped in the doorway. You'll regret this, maybe, but standing there in my own doorway, finally holding a line nobody else could move for me, I realized something that mattered more. Dignity requires knowing when to close the door. The apartment door shut behind them with enough force to rattle the cheap picture frame hanging beside my kitchen. Then everything got quiet. No crying, no speeches. No more family requires sacrifice. Just the low hum of my refrigerator and the sound of my laptop opening on the dining table 20 minutes later. People think conflict always ends with yelling. Most real damage happens in silence. I changed into gray PT shorts and an old army sweatshirt, tied my hair back, and opened the county records website Grandma had shown me years earlier. The glow from the laptop lit half the apartment while the rest stayed dark except for the microwave clock blinking 9:47 p.m. Outside, rain started again. Light this time. I clicked through parcel records slowly and methodically. No anger. No panic. That's the thing military engineering drills into your brain after enough field exercises and emergency response operations. Emotion does not stabilize a structure. Procedure does. I opened a fresh folder on my desktop. Vance Property. Legal. Inside it, I started organizing documents one by one. Recorded deed transfer, county parcel map, property tax receipts, survey easement diagrams, photographs of the driveway access point, everything dated, everything clean, everything real. Unlike Marcus's entire business model. My phone buzzed once around 10:03 p.m. Marcus. Ignored. Another buzz, then another. Finally, a voicemail notification. I played it on speaker while reviewing the GIS overlay. Alina, this is getting insane, Marcus snapped. Sterling's attorneys are involved now. You're making everybody look stupid. Everybody. Again. Funny how everybody always turned out to mean Marcus plus whoever currently paid attention to him. He kept talking. You're not thinking strategically here. That almost made me choke on my coffee. An Army Corps engineer being lectured about strategy by a man whose biggest professional skill involved describing granite countertops with confidence. Delete. I pulled the original survey map closer across the table. The driveway access line crossed directly through my parcel before reaching the farmhouse. No easement modification had ever been filed, meaning legally, no contractor, no demolition crew, no investor vehicle. Nobody touched that property without crossing my land first. Grandma Margaret really had thought of everything. At 7:12 the next morning, I walked into the base legal assistance office, carrying a binder thick enough to stop small-caliber ammunition. Captain Ruiz looked up from behind her desk as I entered. You're either buying a missile silo, she said, or suing relatives, second one. She nodded immediately. Ah, the more exhausting category. That woman had probably seen 15 military divorces before breakfast. I sat down and opened the binder. She reviewed the documents quietly for several minutes, occasionally humming, occasionally flipping pages faster. Then she leaned back in her chair. Well, she said carefully, your grandmother was terrifying. I smiled slightly. Yeah. She severed the land ownership perfectly. Ruiz tapped the survey map. And unless there's hidden documentation somewhere, your family cannot legally develop or even access the property commercially without your authorization. That's what I figured. She looked at me over the folder. You planning to negotiate? No. Quick answer. Even surprised me a little. Captain Ruiz studied my face for another second before nodding slowly. Then let's make boundaries very clear. For the next 2 hours, we drafted a forcible cease and desist notice. Professional tone. No emotion, no threats. Just facts. Unauthorized representations of ownership. Interference with property rights. Potential trespassing liability. Fraudulent disclosure concerns involving third-party developers. Every sentence clean and direct. That's another thing civilians misunderstand about military paperwork. The scariest documents aren't dramatic. They're calm. By lunchtime, we attached supporting evidence behind the letter. County tax receipts proving I'd quietly paid land taxes for 4 consecutive years. Surveyor certifications, parcel diagrams, aerial maps with access routes highlighted in yellow. Captain Ruiz paused while reviewing the final draft. You never told them you were paying taxes? Nope. Why? I thought about it honestly. Because people who ignore foundations don't notice maintenance. She laughed once at that. Then slid the final paperwork toward me for review. At the bottom sat my full name beside the official language. Elena Mary Vance Soul, recorded landowner. Seeing it in writing felt strangely peaceful. Not victorious, just settled. Like finally standing on solid ground after years of listening to people insist the floor belonged to them. Back at my apartment later that afternoon, I printed the full packet on thick white paper. The printer clicked steadily across the quiet room, page after page after page. No screaming, no emotional speeches, just evidence. I arranged everything carefully inside a fresh manila envelope from the office supply cabinet under my sink. Deed first, survey maps second, tax records third, cease and desist on top, precise, ordered, controlled. Then I sealed the envelope and placed it on the kitchen counter. For a second, I just stood there looking at it. It's strange what adulthood actually turns out to be. When you're younger, you think strength means confrontation. Sometimes strength is just documentation prepared correctly. My phone buzzed again. Eleanor this time. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked into the bathroom and adjusted my uniform collar in the mirror before heading back to base for afternoon briefing. Name tape straight, hair tight, posture level. Outside, the Missouri sky had turned heavy gray again. Storm weather. I looked at my reflection for another second. No tears, no rage, no shaking hands. That part of me was gone now. Because somewhere between Grandma's porch and my parents standing in my apartment demanding surrender, I finally understood something simple. My family believed volume created authority. But engineers know better. Real strength comes from load-bearing structures. And paperwork. I answered their shouting with unarguable paperwork. The steady clicking of my keyboard gave way to smooth jazz, drifting through Grandma Margaret's farmhouse 6 days later. Somebody had opened all the windows despite the October wind, probably to make the place smell fresh for investors. The result was a mix of cold air, expensive perfume, catered crab cakes, and old cedar jaw walls that still carried 30 years of fireplace smoke. I parked beside 3 luxury SUVs already crowding the gravel driveway. Mercedes, Range Rover, a Tesla with custom matte paint that looked like somebody wrapped a refrigerator in sadness. Marcus was hosting what he called an investor open house, because apparently you can't destroy a family property without shrimp appetizers anymore. I sat in my truck for a moment watching people through the farmhouse windows. Men in quarter-zip sweaters, women carrying champagne flutes and using words like opportunity corridor. The old porch light Grandma used to leave on for me during storms had been replaced with decorative lantern bulbs. Of course it had. Marcus loved cosmetic upgrades on structures he didn't understand. I picked up the manila envelope from the passenger seat, still sealed, still crisp. Then I stepped out. The gravel crunched sharply beneath my boots as jazz music drifted from inside the house. Somebody laughed too loudly near the kitchen. Performance laughter, investor laughter. The front door stood open when I reached the porch. For half a second, I saw it the way it used to be. Grandma in her rocking chair, coffee brewing, Cardinals game on low volume. Now there was a bartender standing where Grandpa's old tool cabinet used to sit. That felt illegally somehow. I walked inside wearing my operational uniform, sleeves pressed sharp, brass buttons catching the late afternoon sunlight cutting through the windows. Conversations slowed immediately. Not stopped, slowed. There's a specific silence rich people create when somebody enters a room who reminds them consequences exist. Marcus stood near the fireplace in a charcoal-tailored suit, holding a champagne flute beside a tall, silver-haired man I recognized immediately from online research. Arthur Sterling. Sterling Capital, 58 years old. Northwestern MBA, built a reputation buying distressed commercial properties across Missouri and Illinois, the kind of man who could smell weak contracts before dessert arrived. Marcus spotted me first. His face changed instantly, not panic yet. More like a casino dealer realizing somebody just sat down counting cards. "Elinas," he said too loudly. "What a surprise." "No," I replied calmly. "A surprise is finding out you sold land you don't own." Dead silence nearby. A woman near the dining room slowly lowered her champagne glass. "Good. Let them hear it." Eleanor appeared from the hallway almost immediately, moving fast enough to nearly trip over the hardwood transition strip. "Honey," she whispered sharply, grabbing my arm. "Not here." I looked down at her hand until she let go. Interesting how family matters stay private, only applies when the truth embarrasses them publicly. Marcus recovered quickly and forced a laugh toward the room. "My sister's in the Army Corps of Engineers," he explained to Mr. Sterling. "Very detail-oriented. Translation. Please ignore the armed legal problem in front of you." Mr. Sterling studied me quietly. Unlike Marcus, he didn't smile automatically. That's usually how you recognize actual power. Marcus stepped closer. "We're in the middle of discussing demolition timelines." "Demolition?" I repeated. "That's ambitious considering nobody here legally owns driveway access." There it was, the first visible crack. Arthur Sterling's expression changed slightly. Tiny shift, but real. Marcus noticed too. "Okay," he said quickly. "Can we not do this in front of everyone?" "You already did." Eleanor moved beside me again, voice tight with panic now. "Please, let's talk privately." No, that word landed harder than yelling would. Because calm refusal scares manipulative people more than anger does. Marcus laughed again, thinner this time. "This is honestly becoming dramatic." I looked around the room. Catered food, champagne, architectural renderings framed beside Grandma's piano. My family had turned a property dispute into a networking event, and somehow I was the dramatic one. I stepped past my mother and walked directly toward Arthur Sterling. To his credit, he didn't retreat. Up close, he smelled faintly like expensive cologne and old paper currency. His watch probably cost more than my truck. "Mr. Sterling," I said professionally, "Captain Elena Vance, United States Army Corps of Engineers." He nodded once. "I know who you are now. I'm the sole legal owner of the land beneath and surrounding this structure." Marcus immediately interrupted. "Temporary complication." "No," Sterling said quietly without taking his eyes off me. "Not temporary." That shut Marcus up. I handed Sterling the manila envelope. Clean movement, steady hand, no emotion. Inside sat the deed transfer, parcel maps, county filing, tax records, and formal cease and desist, notice Marcus had apparently ignored all week. Sterling opened the envelope slowly, while the jazz music continued floating awkwardly through the room behind us. Nobody talked anymore. Even the bartender stopped moving. I watched Sterling read the first page, then the second, then the survey map. His face never changed dramatically, but years of engineering briefings taught me how to read small reactions. The pause at the easement section told me exactly when he realized the deal was dead. Marcus stepped forward desperately. "Arthur, listen, this can still be negotiated." Sterling raised one finger without looking at him. Not angry. Worse, disappointed. He closed the folder carefully, picked up his champagne flute from the mantel, looked at it for a second, then set it back down untouched. Crystal tapped wood softly, tiny sound, huge consequence. Then Arthur Sterling turned and walked straight toward the front door without saying another word. No speech, no threats, no dramatic exit, just gone. A second later, I heard gravel crunch beneath expensive shoes outside. The room stayed completely still. Marcus looked around desperately at the remaining investors, but the energy had already changed. You could feel it collapsing in real time. Conversations died mid-sentence. Somebody quietly set down an appetizer plate. One couple slipped toward the front hallway without making eye contact. Because once real paperwork enters a room full of performance, the performance ends fast. Marcus finally looked at me fully, not arrogant anymore, not charming, just exposed. And standing there inside the farmhouse my grandmother protected long before any of us realized why, I understood something cold and permanent. The truth didn't need revenge. It only needed documentation. The truth brought down the entire house. The jazz music disappeared. The second Arthur Sterling walked out the front door, not faded, stopped, like somebody finally unplugged the illusion. For a moment, all you could hear inside the farmhouse was the soft rattle of tree branches outside and the nervous shifting of expensive shoes against old hardwood floors. Then people started leaving, quietly, fast. One investor muttered something about circling back later, which is corporate language for this deal is dead and I want my parking validated. Another man avoided eye contact with Marcus completely while grabbing his coat from the dining room chair. Nobody touched the champagne after that. Marcus stood frozen near the fireplace while the room emptied around him in slow motion. His tailored suit suddenly looked too tight across the shoulders. My father kept opening his mouth like he wanted to say something authoritative, but authority gets slippery when reality enters the room holding county records. Eleanor looked the worst, not angry, not sad, humiliated, because the one thing my mother feared more than failure was public embarrassment, especially among wealthy people, pretending not to gossip while to absolutely gossiping. I left before anybody recovered enough to restart the argument. The gravel crunched beneath my boots again as I walked toward my truck under a cold Missouri sunset. Wind moved through the oak trees lining the property, while somewhere behind me, the farmhouse door shut hard enough to echo across the fields. Nobody followed me outside. That part mattered more than I expected. 3 weeks later, Marcus Vance Realty Group announced a temporary operational restructuring on their website, which was adorable, because bankruptcy always sounds fancier after a marketing consultant edits it. I found out accidentally while waiting for coffee near base housing. One of the civilian contractors recognized my last name and asked if Marcus was doing okay after that Sterling situation. Apparently, the story traveled fast through St. Louis real estate circles. Developers talk, title agents talk even more, and rich people absolutely cannot resist disaster involving other rich people, especially when champagne was present. Marcus stopped calling after the second week. Richard left exactly one voicemail saying, "Hope you're happy." No follow-up, no apology, just emotional outsourcing in audio form. Eleanor disappeared socially almost overnight. A woman she used to play tennis with at Old Hawthorne Country Club posted photos from a charity luncheon online, and for the first time in maybe 15 years, my mother wasn't in them. That probably hurt her more than losing the deal, which sounds cruel to say. But some people build their identity so completely around appearances that public silence feels like exile. I didn't celebrate any of it. That surprised me. I thought maybe I'd feel victorious. Instead, I mostly felt tired, because winning against your own family still feels like losing something. Late October arrived colder than usual that year. Wind pushed dry leaves across the highways, and the trees near the property turned burnt orange and dark gold almost overnight. One Saturday morning, I drove back out to the farmhouse alone. No phone calls, no meetings, no legal discussions. Just me, my truck, and a thermos of bad coffee Grandma would have insulted immediately. The property looked smaller somehow without people trying to monetize it. The for sale signage was gone. So were the investor banners Marcus had temporarily installed near the road. Only the farmhouse remained. White paint peeling quietly near the porch rails, windows reflecting pale morning light. Still standing, still stubborn. The gravel crunched softly beneath my boots as I walked toward the oak tree beside the driveway. Cold air carried the smell of damp earth and cedar again, almost exactly the way it had during storms years earlier with Grandma. Funny how land remembers scents longer than people remember promises. I stood there for a while, listening to wind move through the branches overhead. No jazz music, no investor speeches, no family vote. Just silence, real silence, the peaceful kind, not the tense kind people fake at dinner tables. I walked down toward the edge of the property, near the drainage ditch where runoff collected after heavy rain. My engineering brain automatically soil laturation out of habit. Still stable. Grandma would have liked hearing that. The ground felt soft beneath my boots from rain earlier that week. I crouched beside the ditch and pressed my hand into the damp earth slowly. Cold, solid, real, that moment hit harder than I expected. Not emotionally dramatic, just heavy in a quiet way. Because suddenly I understood what Grandma Margaret had actually spent years trying to teach me. Boundaries are not cruelty. Ownership is not selfishness. And protecting something does not make you difficult simply because other people wanted access to it. Wind rustled through the oak branches overhead while I let the dirt run slowly between my fingers. 4.2 acres, that was all. Not a kingdom, not a fortune, just ground. But sometimes the smallest piece of ground in your life becomes the line separating dignity from surrender. I looked back toward the farmhouse sitting quietly beneath the pale autumn sky, unsold, undeveloped, untouched, perfectly protected by the soil underneath it. For years, my family thought power belonged to the loudest voice in the room. Marcus believed confidence could override paperwork. My father believed authority automatically created obedience. Eleanor believed guilt could unlock any door eventually. But none of them understood foundations. And foundations decide what stays standing after pressure arrives. I stayed there another hour drinking terrible coffee on Grandma's porch while leaves scraped softly across the wooden steps. Nobody called. Nobody interrupted. For the first time in a long while, silence didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. Before leaving, I walked down the porch stairs and looked once more across the property. Grandma loved enough to protect properly before she died. Then I brushed the dirt from my hands and finally understood the lesson sitting underneath this entire mess from the beginning. True respect is not given to people who demand it loudest. It belongs to the people who know exactly where their foundation lies. A house can be bought, but the ground must be held. The wind through the oak trees stayed with me long after I left the farmhouse that morning. Not because it sounded poetic. Honestly, most of the drive back to base involved me yelling at a gas station coffee that somehow tasted both burnt and watery at the same time. Missouri deserves prison time for some of its roadside coffee. But somewhere around mile marker 119, I realized something I probably should have understood years earlier. Winning against your family still feels strange even when you were right. A lot of people imagine these situations ending with closure. Somebody apologizes, somebody cries. Everybody suddenly admits you were treated unfairly. That almost never happens. Real life is usually quieter than that. After the Sterling deal collapsed, my family didn't suddenly become reflective people who discovered emotional maturity through hardship. Marcus never called and said, "You know what, Elena? I manipulated the situation and treated you like an obstacle instead of a person." That would require self-awareness. Marcus responded the way people like Marcus usually do when consequences finally arrive. He blamed the person who stopped the collapse from landing on them. Richard stayed angry for a while too. But underneath the anger, I think what really bothered him was something else: loss of control. Parents like my father get very uncomfortable when the child they underestimated stops asking permission, especially daughters. Eleanor took the social route. That one almost would have been funny if it wasn't so sad. Apparently, several women at her country club heard about the failed development deal before she could spin the story properly. Rich suburban communities treat gossip like it's an Olympic sport sponsored by Chardonnay. And once people started asking questions, my mother suddenly stopped attending brunch events. That's the thing about people who build their identity around appearances. Embarrassment hits them harder than truth ever does. But here's the part I really want people listening to understand. The hardest thing about this entire situation was not standing up to my family. The hardest thing was accepting that love and access are not the same thing. Some people only feel connected to you when they can influence you, control you, use you. And if you spend enough years being the responsible one in the family, eventually everybody starts treating your stability like public property. You become the emotional utility bill everybody expects to stay paid. The dependable child, the calm one, the fixer, the person who absorbs pressure so everybody else stays comfortable. Until one day you finally say no, and suddenly people act shocked that the person they kept pushing finally stopped moving. That's why boundaries upset manipulative people so much. Not because boundaries are cruel, because boundaries expose relationships that were built on convenience instead of respect. I spent years thinking being a good daughter meant tolerating behavior that slowly drained me. I confused silence with maturity. I confused endurance with loyalty. A lot of people do that, especially people raised in families where keeping peace mattered more than telling the truth. But peace built on self-erasure never lasts. Eventually something breaks. And honestly, I'm glad it did. Because for the first time in my adult life, I finally understood something Grandma Margaret probably figured out decades earlier. You cannot build healthy relationships with people who only value you when you are sacrificing yourself for them. That isn't love. That's dependency wearing family clothing. And if there's one thing I hope people take from this story, it's this. You are allowed to protect your peace without explaining yourself into exhaustion. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to stop volunteering your emotional energy to people who treat your kindness like an unlimited resource. That doesn't make you cold. It makes you aware. And awareness changes everything. The first frost showed up 3 weeks later. Not enough to fully freeze the ground, but enough to leave a thin white layer across the grass when I pulled into the farmhouse driveway just after sunrise. The property looked different in cold weather, quieter, more honest somehow. No investor banners, no luxury renderings taped to walls, no strangers walking through Grandma's kitchen pretending exposed brick automatically makes its place historic. Just the farmhouse, still standing exactly where it always had. I carried a thermos onto the porch and sat in Grandma Margaret's old chair while cold wind moved through the trees near the pasture. That chair still creaked the same way. I liked that. Some things shouldn't improve. For a long time, I thought Grandma left me land because she trusted me the most. But sitting there that morning watching frost melt slowly off the fence posts, I realized that wasn't the full reason. Grandma left me responsibility because she understood people better than I did, especially family. She knew Marcus would eventually confuse appearance with value. She knew Richard would measure success by whoever looked richest at dinner. And she definitely knew Eleanor could turn guilt into an Olympic event if enough money got involved. But the part I missed for years was this. Grandma also understood me, better than I understood myself. She knew my biggest weakness wasn't fear. It was tolerance. I tolerated disrespect because I thought maturity meant staying calm no matter what people did to me. I tolerated imbalance because I thought being dependable made me a good daughter. A lot of responsible people fall into that trap, especially inside families. The reliable child becomes emotional infrastructure. Everybody leans on them because they know they won't collapse publicly. Then one day the reliable person finally says no, and suddenly everyone acts betrayed. Not because the boundary is unfair, because the free access ended. That realization changed the way I see people now. You learn a lot about relationships when you stop automatically fixing problems for others. Some people adapt and respect you more. Others panic because they never actually learned how to relate to you without benefiting from your silence. And honestly, that distinction is valuable. One thing I wish more people understood is that manipulation rarely sounds aggressive at first. Usually it sounds loving. Do this for the family. Don't make things difficult. After everything we've done for you, people use emotional urgency because urgency keeps you from thinking clearly. That's true in relationships, business, money, even contracts. Especially contracts. Never sign anything important while somebody is pressuring you emotionally. Is it your answer immediately? There's usually a reason they don't want you thinking carefully. That lesson alone probably saves people thousands of dollars and several years of therapy. I've also learned that calm people survive conflict better, not passive people. Calm people. There's a difference. Passive people surrender. Calm people observe. Marcus lost control because he believed confidence could overpower reality. He built his entire strategy around performance instead of structure. But structures matter. Foundations matter. Facts matter. That applies to life way beyond land ownership. A relationship with no trust eventually collapses. A friendship with no reciprocity eventually collapses. A family dynamic built entirely around guilt eventually collapses too. Everything unstable fails eventually. That's basic engineering. And basic life. The cold air stung my face while I sat there drinking coffee terrible enough to make Grandma complain from beyond the grave. Somewhere near the barn, wind rattled loose, sheet metal softly against the frame. For the first time in years, the farmhouse didn't feel heavy to me anymore. It felt peaceful. Not because conflict disappeared, because confusion did. I finally stopped trying to earn love by disappearing inside other people's expectations. And that changes a person quietly. The porch door creaked softly behind me as the sun started dropping behind the oak trees. Missouri sunsets in late fall don't look dramatic the way movies pretend they do. Mostly everything just turns gray-orange for a while, and the air gets cold fast enough to remind you winter's coming, whether you're emotionally prepared or not. I stood near the porch railing with my jacket zipped halfway up, looking across the property Grandma Margaret protected so carefully. And honestly, by that point, I understood the story differently than I did at the beginning. This was never really about land. The land just exposed everybody. That's what pressure does. Pressure reveals structure. You find out very quickly who values integrity and who values access, who respects boundaries and who only respects convenience, who sees relationships as mutual and who sees them as leverage. Most people watching this probably have some version of ground in their own life right now. Maybe it's money, maybe it's time, maybe it's emotional energy, maybe it's your peace, your marriage, your future plans, your mental health, or simply the right to exist without constantly managing everybody else's expectations. And if you don't protect that ground early enough, eventually somebody else starts acting like it belongs to them. That's the dangerous part. Not all manipulation looks aggressive. Some of it looks helpful, some of it sounds loving, some of it arrives wrapped in family language and concern. But pay attention to patterns. People who truly respect you do not punish you for having limits. They may feel disappointed sometimes. That's normal. Healthy relationships survive disappointment. Manipulative relationships treat boundaries like betrayal. That difference matters more than most people realize. One thing I had to learn the hard way is that being needed is not the same thing as being valued. A lot of responsible people build their identity around usefulness. They become the dependable friend, the fixer, the financially stable sibling, the emotionally calm partner, and after enough years, everybody around them starts assuming they'll continue absorbing pressure forever, until they stop. Then suddenly people act shocked. Not because the boundary is unreasonable, because the arrangement changed. Marcus thought confidence made him powerful. My father thought volume made him powerful. Eleanor thought guilt made her powerful. But none of those things survive reality for very long. You know what actually holds up under pressure? Documentation, consistency, patience, self-respect. People underestimate calm individuals all the time because calm doesn't perform itself loudly. But some of the strongest people you'll ever meet are simply people who no longer panic when somebody tries to manipulate them emotionally. That kind of stability changes your entire life. And I want to say something directly to anybody listening who constantly feels guilty for protecting themselves. Guilt does not automatically mean you're wrong. Sometimes guilt just means you were trained to prioritize everybody else's comfort over your own well-being. That conditioning runs deep in families, especially families where peace depended on one person staying quiet. But eventually you reach a point where silence becomes expensive, emotionally expensive, mentally expensive, sometimes financially expensive too. And once you realize that, boundaries stop feeling cruel. They start feeling necessary. The wind moved through the oak trees again, while I stepped off the porch one last time before leaving. Dry leaves scraped softly across the gravel near my truck tires. The farmhouse stood quietly behind me, still old, still imperfect, still standing. And maybe that's the part I appreciate most now. Not everything strong looks polished. Some things survive simply because their foundation was protected before the storm arrived. I locked the front door, slipped the keys into my jacket pocket, and looked once more across the property before walking toward the truck. People spend years chasing bigger houses, nicer titles, more status, more approval. Meanwhile, they completely ignore the ground underneath their own lives. But foundations decide everything. Always. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel. There are a lot of people out there still learning how to protect their peace, their boundaries, and the parts of themselves other people keep trying to claim. Sometimes hearing somebody else finally hold their ground helps them realize they can too.